The cold wind bit at her skin, carrying the faint scent of rain in the air, but she didn't notice. She was too focused on the little boy lying weakly in the back of the old, rusted car, his breath shallow and fragile. His fever had been raging for days, and no matter how hard she tried, no doctor, no medicine, could ease his suffering. The desperation in her eyes was undeniable. Her name was Emily, and she had come to the end of her rope. A mother would do anything for her child, and Emily was no different. But today she was doing something she had never imagined herself doing, standing in the middle of the road singing. The song she sang wasn't just a melody, it was a prayer, a plea to the universe, to anyone who might be listening, to help her save her son. She sang with all the love and hope she had left, her voice trembling with emotion. The song was familiar to her, a lullaby her mother used to sing when she was a child. She had no idea why it had come to her in this moment, but something inside her told her that maybe, just maybe, it was the key to saving him. As her voice echoed through the empty street, there was a strange feeling in the air, a sense that something was about to change. The world seemed to hold its breath as Emily's song floated into the night. Then she heard it, the distant rumble of an engine, growing louder with each passing second. At first, she thought it was just another car speeding by, indifferent to the desperate mother in the street. But the sound was different. The engine roared with power, the growl of something expensive, something rare. She didn't stop singing, but her heart quickened as the vehicle drew closer. A sleek, black Cadillac slowly rolled to a stop in front of her, its headlights blinding her for a brief moment. Emily didn't know what to make of it. Who would be driving a car like that through such a quiet, forgotten road? The car's engine cut off, and for a moment, there was only silence. She stopped singing, her throat tight with a mix of hope and fear. The last notes of her song hung in the air like a fragile thread, waiting to snap. The door of the Cadillac opened, and a tall figure stepped out. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his dark hair slicked back. His eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, but there was something about him, something about the way he carried himself, that made her gut twist with unease. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, looking at her with an unreadable expression. Emily felt a wave of confusion and curiosity wash over her. Who was this man? What was he doing here, and why had he stopped? The silence stretched on, suffocating her, making her second-guess herself. Finally, the man spoke, his voice smooth and calm, almost too calm. "That was beautiful," he said, his tone soft but firm. "You have a remarkable voice." Emily blinked, taken aback. She hadn't expected him to say anything, let alone compliment her. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words stuck in her throat. What could she say? She had just been singing to save her son. She didn't have time for compliments. She glanced back at the car, her heart pounding. "My son," she managed to say, her voice breaking. "He's sick. I need help. Please." The man nodded slowly, as if considering her words carefully. "I can see that," he said, his gaze flickering to the car where her son lay. "What's wrong with him?" Emily's hands trembled as she tried to explain. "I don't know. The doctors. They can't figure it out. He's too weak. Nothing is working." Her voice faltered again, and she swallowed hard. "I need help. Please, I don't know what else to do." The man's gaze softened slightly, but there was something in his eyes that made Emily uneasy. He took a step closer to her, his movements smooth and calculated. "I think I can help you," he said, his voice low and almost hypnotic. "But first, I need you to come with me." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Emily took a step back, her mind racing. She didn't trust him. She didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but something in the way he spoke, in the way he looked at her, told her she should be careful. She had no choice but to consider it, though. Her son's life was on the line. I don't know," she said hesitantly, her voice shaking with uncertainty. "I can't just leave him. I can't go anywhere without him." The man's lips curled into a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I understand. But I think you'll find that what I offer will be the only chance your son has. You don't have many options left." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. The tension in the air was thick, the world around her fading into the background as she focused solely on the man standing before her. He hadn't mentioned what kind of help he could provide, but his words were enough to make her heart race with a mix of hope and fear. She glanced back at the car, at the little boy who had once been so full of life, now pale and fragile. Could she trust this stranger? Could she afford not to? With a deep breath, she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want me to do?" The man's smile deepened, his posture shifting as he took a step closer, a glimmer of something dangerous in his eyes. "Come with me," he said again, his voice smooth like velvet. and I'll show you the way to save your son." But what was he offering? What did he want in return? Emily didn't know, but she had no choice. She was running out of time. As she took a step toward him, the weight of the decision hit her like a ton of bricks. Would she regret this? Would her son's life be the price she paid for trusting a stranger? Or was this the chance she had been waiting for? The Cadillac's engine roared to life once more, the sound echoing in her ears as the man opened the door, motioning for her to get in. The world seemed to hold its breath as Emily hesitated for just a moment longer, her mind spinning with questions she couldn't answer. Emily hesitated for a brief moment, her heart pounding in her chest. The world around her seemed to blur as she focused only on the man standing before her, his words echoing in her mind. He had promised to help her son, but at what cost? She glanced back at the rusted car, at the sickly figure of her son lying in the back seat, eyes closed, breathing shallow. He was all she had left in this world. The thought of losing him made her stomach churn with dread. With a deep breath, she stepped forward, her legs shaking beneath her. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she had no other choice. She had tried everything, begged everyone she could think of for help, and now the stranger was her last hope. The man smiled as she moved closer, his sharp, calculating gaze never leaving her. He opened the door of the Cadillac for her, the interior plush and luxurious, almost out of place on this quiet, desolate road. Emily hesitated for a moment longer, the noise of the world fading as she struggled to steady her breath. What was she doing? She didn't know this man. She didn't know what he was capable of. But then she looked at her son again, and the fear of losing him overpowered everything else. "I'll do it for him," she whispered to herself, more as a reassurance than anything else, before she climbed into the car. The door shut behind her with a soft click, and she settled into the deep leather seat, feeling the cool air inside the Cadillac. It was a strange contrast to the tension bubbling within her. The man slid into the driver's seat without a word, starting the engine with a smooth hum that vibrated through her bones. For a moment, the silence between them was thick, almost suffocating. She glanced at him, trying to gauge his intentions. His profile was sharp, his face unreadable beneath the dark sunglasses. She couldn't even tell his age. He could have been in his 30s or his 50s. There was something ageless about him. He wore a tailored suit, the kind you only saw in movies or on people who had more money than anyone could dream of. But money couldn't buy her son's health. She clutched her hands together in her lap, her fingernails digging into her palms. The Cadillac glided smoothly down the road, and Emily tried to ignore the chill creeping down her spine. The man kept his eyes on the road ahead, his fingers resting lightly on the steering wheel, as if he weren't driving at all, but merely letting the car take him wherever it was supposed to go. "Where are we going?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't want to sound weak, but the question had been burning at her since she'd first gotten in. The man didn't look at her, but his lips curved into a faint smile. "To a place where I can help you," he said, his voice smooth, almost comforting. "But first, you need to understand something." Emily's stomach twisted. She didn't like the way his words hung in the air like a threat she hadn't fully understood yet. "Understand what?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, but she could hear the tremor in it. "People like me don't offer help without getting something in return," he replied, his voice low and steady, as if speaking the truth of the world. He didn't pause to let that sink in before continuing. "I offer you a chance to save your son. But there's a price, Emily, a price you'll have to pay." She froze at the mention of her name. How did he know who she was? She hadn't told him. She hadn't even given him a chance to ask. "How do you?" "It's not important," he interrupted, his voice suddenly sharper. "What matters is that you understand the cost. I'm not doing this out of the goodness of my heart. I'm offering you a way out, but nothing in this world is free." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Emily's mind raced. What kind of help was he offering? And what would he want in return? The man hadn't given any specifics. He hadn't even told her who he was or what his intentions were. But he had her son's life in his hands, and that was enough to make her heart ache with fear. "But what's the price?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. The man's lips curved into a smile, but this time there was no warmth in it. "You'll find out soon enough." The car sped down the road, the lights of the Cadillac cutting through the darkness. Emily's thoughts were spinning. What had she gotten herself into? She could still turn back, couldn't she? She had the chance to get out of the car, to run back to her son and find another way. But what if there wasn't another way? What if this was it? What if this was her only chance to save him? The man glanced at her, his sunglasses hiding his eyes, but Emily could feel his gaze on her. "Don't worry, Emily," he said, his tone almost soothing. "Everything will be fine. Your son will get the help he needs. But first, you'll need to make a choice." "A choice?" Emily echoed, confused. "What kind of choice?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his attention back to the road, driving with a steady hand. The silence stretched between them again, and Emily's heart raced. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions, but none of them seemed to make sense. What kind of choice was he talking about? The car began to slow as they approached a large iron gate that seemed to appear out of nowhere. It was tall, imposing, and surrounded by thick trees, their branches reaching out like dark, skeletal arms. The gate creaked open on its own, as if expecting them. The man didn't slow down as they passed through it, and Emily's stomach twisted in discomfort. The road ahead was long, winding through dense woods, the only light coming from the headlights of the Cadillac. She wanted to ask more questions, but the words stuck in her throat. A thick tension filled the air, and she knew that whatever was about to happen would change everything. The man spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "We're almost there. When we arrive, you'll see what I can offer, and you'll be given a choice." He paused, his lips curling into that same unsettling smile. "But remember, every choice has consequences." Emily felt a chill settle deep in her bones. As the car continued through the dark woods, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was heading into something far darker than she had ever imagined. Would she regret this? Would she ever get her son back? Or had she just sealed their fate? The car continued to glide through the winding road, its headlights the only source of light in the suffocating darkness. Emily's heart was racing, her breath shallow, as she tried to process everything that had happened so far. She glanced at the man sitting next to her, his face still hidden behind those dark glasses, his presence unnervingly calm. It felt like they were traveling to a place outside of reality, where the rules were different, and the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. The trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, their branches twisting into gnarled shapes as if trying to reach out and grab them. The air felt thick, heavy with something she couldn't name. Emily's hands were clenched in her lap, her body tense, her mind racing with questions, none of which seemed to have answers. The man didn't speak again. The silence grew oppressive, filling the car like an invisible weight. Emily tried to focus on her son, the faint sound of his breathing from the back seat, the only thing that kept her tethered to reality. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to push aside the fear that was threatening to consume her. The sickness that had taken her son so quickly, the doctor's baffling inability to diagnose it, the helplessness she had felt, it all seemed like a distant nightmare now. And yet here she was in the strange car with a man who had offered her an impossible promise. It felt like she was losing grip on everything she had ever known. The man suddenly spoke, his voice cutting through the silence. "You're wondering what the price is, aren't you?" Emily turned to face him, her heart skipping a beat. His words were so direct, so knowing, it sent a chill through her. She didn't want to acknowledge it, but the question had been on her mind since the moment he'd mentioned it. What was the price? What did he want from her in exchange for saving her son? She swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "What do you mean by a price? What do you want from me?" The man's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "It's not what I want, Emily. It's what you're willing to give." She frowned, trying to make sense of his cryptic words. "What does that mean?" He didn't answer immediately, his gaze still fixed on the road ahead. For a moment, Emily thought he wouldn't answer at all. But then he spoke again, his voice quieter this time, as if sharing something personal. "Everyone has something they hold dear," he said, his tone almost philosophical. "A part of them they would do anything to protect. And when you're desperate enough, when you're willing to sacrifice everything, that's when you make deals. That's when you bargain." Emily's stomach twisted. She was beginning to understand, but she didn't want to. She didn't want to believe that the man was offering her something that came with such a heavy cost. But the way he spoke, the calm assurance in his voice, made it clear that this wasn't some simple favor. She was part of something much darker than she had ever imagined. Her thoughts were interrupted as the car suddenly slowed, the road narrowing as they approached a large, looming structure. The trees parted, revealing an old mansion, its silhouette casting long shadows in the moonlight. The house looked abandoned, like something out of a forgotten past, but there was an eerie sense of life to it. It felt wrong. The Cadillac rolled to a stop in front of the mansion, the headlights illuminating the cracked stone steps leading up to the grand entrance. The man killed the engine and turned to Emily, his expression unreadable beneath the dark glasses. "This is where we begin," he said simply. Emily felt a surge of panic. She had no idea what she was walking into. The fear she had been trying to suppress suddenly bubbled to the surface, threatening to overwhelm her. She looked back at the car where her son still lay, pale and weak, and the weight of the decision she had made crashed down on her. She had no idea what kind of help this man could provide, but she couldn't back out now, not when her son's life hung in the balance. She opened the door and stepped out of the car, her legs unsteady beneath her. The cold night air burned her skin, and she shivered involuntarily. The mansion before her loomed like a dark, foreboding beast, its windows like hollow eyes watching her every move. She glanced at the man, who had already stepped out of the car and was waiting for her, his posture relaxed, almost expectant. "Come along," he said, his voice smooth and unhurried. "There's no turning back now." Reluctantly, Emily followed him up the steps. The air felt thick with tension, every step she took echoing through the night. The door of the mansion creaked open on its own, and she stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The interior was dimly lit, the walls adorned with old portraits that seemed to follow her as she moved. The place was grand, but in a decaying, forgotten way, as though it had been left untouched for years. "Where is he?" Emily asked, her voice tight with urgency. "I need to see him. My son." The man nodded, leading her down a long, narrow hallway. The air inside the mansion was thick with dust, the floor creaking beneath their feet. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that she was stepping into a world where she didn't belong. The further they walked, the more oppressive the atmosphere seemed to become. They reached a door at the end of the hallway, and the man opened it without hesitation. Inside was a small, dimly lit room, its only furnishings a large wooden table in the center. On the table lay a strange array of objects, candles, symbols, and jars filled with what looked like strange, glowing liquids. It looked like something out of an ancient ritual. Emily's eyes widened in disbelief. This wasn't what she had expected. She had thought there would be doctors, or some kind of scientific explanation. But this was beyond anything she could comprehend. The man turned to her, his face still hidden behind the glasses. "This is where your son will be saved," he said, his voice low and almost hypnotic. "But you must understand, Emily, there's no cure without consequence." The words hit her like a punch. The weight of the situation settled heavily on her shoulders, and she felt the familiar panic rising again. What had she walked into? What kind of help was this man offering? And at what price? Before she could ask another question, the man motioned to the table. "Come, you'll need to make your decision now." Emily didn't know what to say, but she walked toward the table, her footsteps unsteady. Her mind raced with possibilities, but none of them felt right. She had no choice but to trust him, hadn't she? But something deep within her screamed that she was walking straight into a trap. As she reached the table, the man placed his hand on her shoulder. "Remember," he said softly, "every choice has a cost, and sometimes the price is higher than you can imagine." The room seemed to close in on her, the shadows growing darker as she stared at the strange objects before her. Was she willing to pay the price? Would she regret this decision for the rest of her life? The tension in the air was palpable, and Emily knew that whatever happened next would change everything. But she couldn't turn back. Not now. The man's hand remained on her shoulder, his touch cold, like a weight pressing down on her chest. Emily's mind spun with confusion and fear, her heart thudding in her chest like a drum. She looked at the table again, her gaze flicking from the glowing jars to the strange, inscribed symbols etched into the wood. Each item seemed to pulse with an eerie energy that made her skin crawl. Her breath quickened. This wasn't just a ritual. This was something much darker. Her son's fragile, labored breathing echoed in her mind. His thin body was still slumped in the back seat of the Cadillac, pale and feverish, barely holding on to life. Every second that passed felt like a countdown, and Emily could feel her desperation growing, gnawing at her insides. She had come this far, hadn't she? She had to trust him, didn't she? But what was she really trusting? What kind of man was this? And what did he want from her? The questions swirled in her mind, but they felt distant, irrelevant now. The only thing that mattered was her son. She had to save him. She had to. The man's voice broke through her thoughts, smooth and steady. "You must choose, Emily. The ceremony begins now." His words were like a command, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to follow. Her eyes locked onto the strange objects before her. There was a jar filled with a glowing liquid, a deep, unnatural green. Another one had a dark liquid that seemed to shimmer with silver threads, as though it contained the very essence of the night sky. And there, near the center of the table, was a small vial, clear and delicate, like glass, containing something that looked almost alive. Emily's gaze shifted back to the man. His expression was still unreadable, those dark glasses hiding whatever emotion he might be feeling. He wasn't rushing her, but she could feel the weight of his silence pressing down on her. He was waiting for her to decide, waiting for her to make the choice that would seal her fate. She wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but the silence in the room was deafening, and she couldn't bring herself to break it. The air was thick with tension, almost suffocating. And then, in the quietest of whispers, she heard her son's voice, soft, fragile, barely audible, but unmistakably real. "Mom." Emily froze, her breath caught in her throat. She turned toward the voice, her heart pounding in her chest. The son wasn't in the car. No, he was here, somewhere in the room, but how? Her eyes darted around the dimly lit space, but there was no sign of him. Her heart raced, and her pulse quickened as the voice came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Mom, please, help me." It sounded like him, her son, pleading for her to save him. But he wasn't here, she knew he wasn't. Was this a trick? Was it part of the ritual? Or was it just her mind breaking under the pressure? She couldn't tell, but the words tore through her like a jagged knife. The man seemed to sense her growing panic. His voice was calm, almost soothing, as he stepped closer. "Listen to the voice, Emily. This is the price. There is always a price for life, but it is not always clear what it will cost." A pulse thudded in her ears as she tried to steady her breathing. She couldn't look away from the table, from the glowing jars, from the strange objects that seemed to pulse with an energy that wasn't of this world. Emily's mind screamed at her to run, to grab her son and flee, but something held her in place. She had come too far to turn back now. She had to know what would happen if she gave in, if she made this choice. Another whisper, this time right behind her. "Mom, I'm so scared." Her knees threatened to buckle beneath her. Emily reached out instinctively, her hands trembling as they hovered over the vials on the table. She could feel the heat from the jars, the power radiating from them, but her fingers hesitated. "Which one?" she whispered to herself. "Which one do I choose?" The man's voice broke into her thoughts once again. "There is no wrong choice, Emily. There is only the choice you are willing to make. The price is yours to decide." The words didn't make sense. How could the price be hers to decide when everything around her felt like it was spiraling out of control? Was she really in charge of this decision? Was she truly the one holding the power? The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Mom, I'm dying. Please help me." Emily's breath hitched in her throat as her hands trembled uncontrollably. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know who to trust. Her mind was a blur of conflicting thoughts, and with every passing second, the room seemed to grow darker, the air thicker. Her son's cries echoed in her ears, so real, so desperate. And then, just as she was about to reach for the vial that seemed to call to her, the man's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with a force that made her flinch. His grip was unyielding, and his voice dropped to a whisper that sent a chill down her spine. "You don't understand, Emily," he said. "Once you make the choice, there is no going back. The price will be paid, and you will live with the consequences for the rest of your life." His words sank deep into her, settling like a weight in her chest. Emily opened her mouth to speak, to demand more answers, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't think straight. The whispers, her son's cries, the man's warnings, they were all coming together, spinning around her until she felt like she was drowning in them. The room was closing in on her. Her son's voice called to her once again, this time louder than ever, more frantic, more desperate. She had to make a choice. She had to decide. But her hand hovered over the table, unsure. The tension was unbearable, thick enough to cut through. The decision was hers, but it felt like there was no right answer, no escape from the choice that loomed before her. Would she give in? Would she sacrifice everything to save him? Or would she walk away, leaving her son to suffer forever? The man's gaze didn't waver as he watched her, his face still hidden behind the dark glasses, waiting for her to make the impossible choice. And in that moment, Emily realized something that struck her like a bolt of lightning. The price wasn't just for her son, it was for her too. With trembling hands, Emily finally reached out, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The moment Emily's fingers brushed against the vial, a sudden jolt of energy surged through her body, like an electric shock. Her skin prickled, her heart skipped a beat, and for a brief second, she thought she might collapse. The air around her thickened, becoming almost suffocating, and the man's hand tightened around her wrist, pulling her back just slightly. "No," he murmured, his voice colder than before, a subtle warning hidden beneath the calm exterior. "You've made a choice, but not the one you think." The words didn't quite register at first. Emily's mind was still spinning, her focus locked on the vial, on the promise of salvation that it seemed to offer. She could almost hear the sound of her son's desperate cries in the back of her mind, urging her to act. But then something else happened. The vial in her hand began to glow, bright, almost blinding, and the liquid inside swirled unnaturally as though it were alive. It moved with a rhythm that didn't match the world around it, as if it were pulling energy from somewhere else, somewhere beyond this room. Emily instinctively pulled her hand back, but it was too late. The glow intensified, and for a split second, everything around her seemed to stop. She couldn't breathe. Her chest tightened, and her vision blurred, the room around her fading into darkness. The man's grip on her wrist tightened, but it didn't matter. The world was slipping away from her. She could no longer hear her son's voice, and in its place, a deep, guttural hum filled the air. It was a sound that vibrated in her bones, unsettling and raw, as though something ancient, something far beyond her understanding, had awakened. And then it all stopped. Emily gasped for air, her lungs filling with a desperate breath. The room came back into focus, but it was different, darker, colder. The man's face had changed, his expression now one of quiet satisfaction. His glasses shimmered, almost gleaming, as though the light had shifted. For the first time, Emily saw something in his eyes, a flicker of emotion, something that wasn't calm, wasn't patient. It was hunger. "You've made a deal, Emily," he said, his voice laced with something that wasn't quite malice, but something much worse. "But not in the way you think." Emily's heart raced, the mind desperately trying to process the shift in the atmosphere. She had touched the vial. She had made the choice. But what had she actually chosen? Was it a price she was paying for her son's life, or something far worse? A sharp crack echoed through the room, snapping her out of her thoughts. Something shifted in the corner of her vision, a movement, too fast to see clearly. And then her son's voice, soft and distant, whispered to her again, but this time it was different. This time it wasn't her son. Emily. Her blood ran cold. The voice was familiar, but distorted, as though it was coming from a place far beyond her reality. It was impossible to place, but it felt wrong. It felt like an intrusion. The man's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "You've heard it, haven't you? The voice is not your son's. At least, not anymore." Emily's pulse hammered in her ears. Her breath became shallow again, the weight of his words sinking in, suffocating her. The room seemed to spin, and her thoughts blurred like smoke in the wind. "What? What do you mean?" She managed, her voice trembling. The man's expression shifted again, his smile widening ever so slightly. "The price has been set, Emily, but it's not a life for a life. No, it's far more complicated than that." She could feel the walls closing in, the air growing thick with something dark, something wrong. The hum from before returned, louder now, filling her mind with a pressure she couldn't escape. It was like a storm was gathering within the room, and Emily felt like she was at its epicenter, powerless to stop it. The man took a slow step toward her, his voice dropping to a low, almost conspiratorial tone. "You thought you were saving your son, but your son was never the one who needed saving. Not from the start." Her mind reeled as the man's words hit her like a punch to the gut. The world around her seemed to twist, the shadows in the room deepening as if they were alive, reaching out to claim her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The world was unraveling, and she had no idea how to stop it. And then the man did something that sent a shockwave through her body, a gesture so subtle, so casual, that it could have been anything. But to Emily, it felt like a trigger, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. A new voice filled the room, one that sounded like her son. His voice, yes, but it was distorted, twisted into something unrecognizable. "Mom, help me." The words were chilling, filled with a hollow, echoing pain that didn't belong to him. Emily's heart stopped. Her stomach lurched. She couldn't process the fear clawing at her chest. What was happening? Was this truly her son, or had she done something to him? Something she couldn't undo. The man's eyes gleamed as he watched her struggle, his lips curling into a grin that sent ice through her veins. "Do you see now, Emily? The price has been paid, but not for what you think. Your son. He's not the one you need to worry about anymore." Her hands shook uncontrollably. She stumbled back, her mind racing. The air was thick with an oppressive energy she couldn't shake, and the shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should. The hum in the room grew louder, vibrating with an intensity that made her teeth rattle. And then, from the corner of the room, something moved, something far too large, far too dark to be human. It was a figure, a silhouette, shifting and swirling like a cloud of smoke, but it wasn't natural. It wasn't human. Emily's mind screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. She couldn't take her eyes off the figure, her heart pounding in her chest. And then, in the blink of an eye, the figure was gone, vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only the eerie hum that filled the room. The man was still standing there, watching her, waiting. The tension in the room was suffocating, and Emily realized with a sickening clarity that she had crossed a line. There was no turning back now. Her son wasn't the one she needed to save, but if he wasn't, then who was?